So just some brief review about mechanisms for heat exchange, just to provide a little bit of context about different cooling options and how they work. So calves, like any other kind of homeothermic animal, needs to maintain their body temperature within a narrow range for proper biological functioning. And so calves are always doing this heat exchange where they are producing metabolic body heat. They're also gaining heat from the environment, and then they're dissipating heat back to that environment. So the goal of a heat abatement system is to both reduce heat gain from the environment and also promote heat loss to help that animal dissipate heat. So when we think about heat abatement strategies for calves, we want to both try to reduce heat gain and promote heat loss. And the options are going to depend on the type of housing facilities and infrastructure. So if you're housing calves in a barn, then the barn roof can provide shade to reduce heat gain from the environment. And if you're housing calves in outdoor hutches, it depends on the material of the hutch. So some hutches have what's called a greenhouse effect, where as the sun shines onto the hutch actually amplifies that heat inside the microclimate. But other hutches can adequately block that solar radiation. So it's going to depend on that hutch material. And so what you can also do is add supplemental shade, either with a shade structure, a shade cloth structure, or natural shade from trees. And then we also need to think about mechanisms for promoting heat loss. So if you have a calf barn, then you can use what's called either mechanical, also known as active ventilation, which is what Dr. Laporta showed in her presentation, by implementing fans inside the barn. And so now you're forcing air to move across the animal and also promoting heat exchange. So getting rid of the stale air and bringing in fresh air. This can also be done with positive pressure tubes, but these are all methods of mechanical or active ventilation. Traditionally, with outdoor hutches, we mainly have only had options for natural or passive ventilation. So in this case, we can exchange air, so remove the stale air from inside the hutch, replace it with fresh air from outside, but using passive strategies. So we're not talking about forcing air through with fans in this traditional model. So options that Dr. Laporta showed include elevating the hutches, either with a stand or putting them up on cinder blocks, or modifying the openings in the hutch to try to promote more air exchange. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, some work that we did here in Wisconsin, where we specifically evaluated ways to add openings to the hutch to see how effective this method is, and also how the calves would respond behaviorally. So what I'm showing here is a diagram illustrating some of the concepts I talked about previously. So you have the sun shining down on the calf hutch, which can contribute this environmental heat load to the hutch and to the calves. But also when the calves are inside, they're producing metabolic body heat and dissipating this heat back to their environment. So when they're inside the hutch, their body heat can contribute to that heat load in the hutch microclimate. So this was prepared by my former student, Dr. Kim Reuscher, and what she's showing on the right side is that we have seen this trend where some farms are adopting pair or group housing, and this can even be done in outdoor hutch systems. And what many studies have shown is that calves do tend to prefer to spend time together. So when two bodies are inside of that hutch, it can potentially contribute even more body heat and heat up that microclimate. And so that's something we wanted to explicitly evaluate. So in this study that Dr. Reuscher did when she was a student at UW-Madison, we used this pair housing model in outdoor hutches, where we took our existing individual hutches and we created pairs by modifying the fencing to group pairs of hutches together. So the calves had one hutch per calf, but they could choose where to spend their time most of the day. And within each pair of hutches, we had one that we considered unventilated, which you're seeing in the picture on the right, where the bedding door is closed and the only opening is the front of the hutch where the calf can go in and out. And on average, the air speeds there were about half a foot per minute, so very little airflow. And then on the left is an example of what we considered our passively ventilated hutch. So we partially propped the bedding door open, but we cable tied it so the calves couldn't get out. And then we also installed these aftermarket portholes, essentially, which can be open in the summer to provide additional passive ventilation or closed in the winter to prevent drafts. And so the calves also had the front door open, but they had this additional air flow through the hutch. And you can see that there was more than 2 orders of magnitude difference in the airflow. So still quite low air speeds. It's passive ventilation, but it made a big difference. And so what you can see here is the baseline temperature humidity index inside of the hutches, which we measured with these little green Kestrel temperature, humidity, and THI loggers that we installed inside of the hutches. And we measured at 3 different points during the pre-weaning period. So week 4 of life when calves were at their peak milk allowance, week 6 when they were approaching weaning, and then week 9 when they were completely weaned but not yet moved to their post-weaning group housing. And so the little blue hutches represent the ventilated ones and the little orange ones represent the non-ventilated ones. So what you can see is that there was a significant difference in the hutch microclimate even without calves inside due to that passive ventilation. And so then what Kim did was during these 3 time points, we repeated this method where we temporarily restricted the calves inside of the hutches. And we restricted them just with a fencing panel, so there was still airflow, but that way we could standardize how much time the calves spent outside the hutch beforehand and then inside the hutch to examine the effect of the calves' body heat on the hutch microclimate and also on the calves' own thermoregulatory responses. So you can see an example here where the calves were restricted separately and then they were switched. And then the next day, they were both restricted inside the same hutch and then moved to the other hutch. And so this order was balanced. So some pairs of calves were together that first day, separate the second day. Sometimes they were in the ventilated hutch first, sometimes in the passive one. So that was completely balanced between all of the pairs of calves. And so now what you can see is after 1 hour inside the hutch, what the THI was inside the hutch. And so after calves were inside, that THI generally went up because the calves were contributing body heat. But the other pattern you can see is that regardless of the week of life, the calves that were inside the ventilated hutch, that hutch had a lower THI after that 1 hour compared to the hutch without ventilation. So the message here is that passive ventilation results in a cooler microclimate inside of the hutch, even when there are 2 calves placed inside. So we also measured the calves' thermoregulatory responses. So what I'm showing you here is the respiration rate at each of these 3 time points in the calves development. And so you can see a dashed line there at 40 breaths per minute, which was that break point that Dr. Laporta's group had identified. And so before we restricted the calves inside the hutches with those wire panels, you can see the baseline respiration rates here, which were all above that 40 THI breakpoint. So this indicates that the calves were indeed experiencing heat stress when they were placed outside of the hutches. But then after 1 hour inside the hutch, what you can see is that with the non-ventilated hutches, that corresponds to the little orange squares with the lungs, the measurement next to that is after the 1 hour, the calves were still experiencing heat stress. So their respiration rate essentially didn't change. So they weren't gaining heat from a greenhouse effect. The hutches were providing protection from solar radiation, but they weren't actively being cooled either. So they were kind of in stasis. But when they were inside those passively ventilated hutches, the respiration rates actually went down and on average were below that 40 breath per minute threshold. So they were becoming cooled through this passive ventilation. What I also want to mention is that after each of these restriction periods in these 3 weeks of life, Dr. Reuscher followed the calves for 3 days using time-lapse trail cameras. And so we monitored their behavior every 15 minutes. We had validated this against shorter intervals, and we found that every 15 minutes was representative of where the calves are spending their time. So we wanted to see, were they outside the hutch, inside the hutch? And if they were inside, were they in the non-ventilated or the passively ventilated hutch? And also, were they in the same location or different locations from each other? And so what you can see on the left side is the preference between the 2 hutch types. So this is excluding time spent outside. And so it's standardized for proportion of time within each hutch. And the orange portion represents the non-ventilated hutch and the blue is the ventilated one. So what you can see is that in week 4 of life, essentially they spent equal time in each hutch type. So it was kind of like a coin toss. But then in week 6 and 9 of life, they had a significant preference for the ventilated hutch. And so what we think might be happening here is that in week 4 of life, their ability to thermoregulate is still developing. So it could be that they actually had no preference because they weren't feeling as heat stressed, or perhaps they were switching where at times they actually wanted to warm up and then cool down. So we can't really disentangle that. But we know that later they developed a significant preference for that ventilated hutch. And so we think as they're developing and as their rumens are developing and they're producing more metabolic body heat, that clearly they were recognizing the difference in those hutch microclimates and responding to that. On the right side, what you can see is the percentage of time that the calves were observed either together, which is the green portion of the bars, or in separate locations. And this is regardless of whether they were outside or inside. And we did examine the patterns depending on the location, and they were identical. So you can see about 80% of the time the calves preferred to be in the same location as each other. And so the conclusions here are that pair house calves prefer to be together. And so if you are using pair housing, it is important to be able to help the calves relieve that additional heat load that two bodies contribute when they're choosing to be inside the same hutch, but that the passive ventilation successfully did so. So it was able to keep them cool, and the calves were responding behaviorally to that and choosing to use that ventilated hutch. And from a practical perspective, it doesn't matter if you're doing pair housing or individual housing. If you have calves and outdoor hutches, this is something that you can adopt. So these window kits exist. They can be added after the fact if your hutch style doesn't already have this amount of passive ventilation. And so this is something that you can take home and try today. And so then I also want to mention and follow up on what Dr. Laporta said, which is that she had this idea to follow up on the work she did in Florida with active ventilation in a calf barn and see if we could perhaps adapt this to a hutch system. So at this time, this is still experimental. It's not something you can go out and purchase, but we think it has a lot of promise. And so I want to thank Dr. Laporta for letting me present this work that we collaborated on. Really, this was her brainchild. So what you can see here is these fans that were solar powered. And so these existing hutches were modified to allow for this mechanical ventilation. And so there were three total treatments, and the first two were identical to what I just presented from Kim Reuscher's work. So there was the passive ventilation with the rear bedding door propped open and those portholes opened, and then the minimal ventilation, which is with the bedding door closed. And so those air speeds were very similar to what we had observed in our previous study. And then the third treatment was this active ventilation with these solar powered fans. And so now you can see that the air speeds were on average 1.7 meters per second, which exceeds the threshold that we recommend for adult cow barns. So we did a separate experiment looking at fans in adult cow barns, and we established that this threshold is what is needed to promote thermoregulation, including adequate resting and lying time in adult cows. And so just really quickly to go over some of the results here, we did see a cooler microclimate when there was ventilation compared to this minimally ventilated hutch situation. But in this case, actually the passive hutch had the lowest THI. So that was just like what we had evaluated in our previous studies. And we think that that could be that in that passive treatment, it wasn't just the portholes that were open, it was also that bedding door. And we know that heat rises, so having that bedding door open may have allowed more heat, more warm air to escape better. Whereas you can see with this active ventilation fan system, where the air was being pumped into the hutch was actually through that bedding door, so the bedding door was kept shut. So this suggested that maybe we needed to refine this particular setup a little bit more. But the fans were effective for helping the calves cool down and thermoregulate. And so you can see here, this is the change in respiration rate from baseline. So a negative number means the calves became cooler. And there was a significantly greater cooling effect of having those active fans compared to that minimal ventilation setup. And I'm not showing the graphs here, but also there was a lower rectal surface temperature. So not internal rectal temperature, but just at the surface of the rectum in both of the passive and the active ventilation treatments. There weren't any differences in skin temperature or rectal temperature or in sweating rate, but that is also similar to what we had found in our study on just the passive ventilation. So the conclusion here from the first study was that the solar powered fans showed promise, both for cooling the microclimate inside the hutches and based on the calves' own thermoregulatory responses. And then Dr. Laporta's lab conducted a follow-up study in the next summer to refine both the ventilation system and the experimental methods to try to further investigate the promise for this. So again, this isn't something that's on the market yet, it's just experimental, but it shows that we can use these innovative new technologies to try to improve heat abatement environment, not just in a calf barn, but bring some of these ideas to outdoor calf hutches as well. So the overall take-home message is that all age classes of dairy cattle feel the heat, including calves. And Dr. Laporta explained why this is and the evidence for that. And also that there are ways to help calves beat the heat even in outdoor hutch systems. And so we can use either passive or active ventilation, both in hutch systems and in a barn.